Hey friends, have you been blessed or encouraged or challenged by Theology in the Raw? If so, would you consider joining Theology in the Raw's Patreon community? For as little as $5 a month, you can gain access to a diverse group of Jesus followers who are committed to thinking deeply, loving widely, and having curious conversations with thoughtful people. We have several membership tiers where you can receive premium content. For instance, silver level supporters get to ask and vote on the questions for our monthly Patreon only podcast. They also get to see like written drafts of various projects and books I'm working on, and there's other perks for that tier. Gold level supporters get all of this and access to monthly Zoom chats where we basically blow the doors open on any topic they want to discuss. All of my patrons play a vital role in nurturing the mission of Theology in the Raw. And for me, just personally, interacting with my Patreon supporters has become one of the hidden blessings in this podcast ministry. So you can check out all of the info at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is my friend Sam Allberry, who is a pastor, an apologist, a speaker, and the author of many books, including Is God Anti-Gay? Why Bother with Church? 7 Myths About Singleness, and What God Has to Say About Our Bodies. He's written extensively for numerous organizations, including the Gospel Coalition, Desiring God, and Living Out. This conversation, we talk about Sam's second edition of his book, Is God Anti-Gay? Which he published 10 years ago, and now he just came out with the second edition. So we talk a lot about what has happened in the times and in the church between the first edition and the second edition. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Sam Allberry. Sam, thanks for coming back on. I think this is the second or third time on Theology in the Raw.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you again. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is we keep in touch, through email and even got to hang out that one time in Nashville, which I think that was the first and only time we've ever had a face-to-face, right? I think. Man.
It was in the English pub in Nashville.
The British, yeah. You might be offended at that pub because it's trying to be a British pub. Some of my listeners might know I'm a huge fan of the old several 100-year-old British pubs. Like there's something so nostalgic about that, kind of like Prancing Pony vibes, I love the hardwood. I'll go around, look at the nooks and crannies, the vibe. I love it. That pub in Nashville is not that, but it comes closer than most British pubs in America that I've seen. At least, well, I don't know.
It's a slightly British themed American bar. But I get what you mean. I miss being around old buildings anyway. There are not an abundance of them in Nashville, but I really miss country pubs, especially. Oh, yeah. Where the ceilings are sloping and there's not a single right angle in the whole building. I've been chatting with my pastor TJ here. I don't know if we're joking or being serious. I hope we're being serious about. We would love to open an English pub in Nashville. Just like a genuine English, low ceilings, old wood, have a log fire, have steak and Guinness pie on the menu, that kind of stuff. It's just such a convivial environment. There's nowhere else like it over here.
Are you? I mean, that's been a dream of mine that I think I will never execute because would take time and money and resources, or just a knowledge base that I don't know how to, I don't know how to open a restaurant, but that would be my dream. Really.
I have no idea, but I would just love to. I just want to be at one. So
I know. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. I'm going to Cambridge in a couple of weeks. Actually twice in the next few months. And there's a few good pubs there. Neighbor and just the sense of community, like the neighborhood, the concept of a neighborhood pub where it's almost like, it's kind of like, how churches are on a parish system where every, so many blocks there's a new church, and it's almost like there's also a pub too, but it has this community vibe. Like I remember I was eating dinner at one and some Brit came up and looked at me and said, "What are you doing at my pub?" I'm like, "Do you own it?" It's like, "No, but this is my neighborhood." And then did you move into the area? It was almost like I would get the same question, like, "Hey, is this your first time at church?" And it just had this strong local community flavor. And I'm like, there's no parallel in the States of something like that. Other than a church, I guess.
And even down to someone saying, "Hey, you're sitting in my seat." There's that sort of sense of, I always sit there.
Yeah.
It's kind of sweet. That's died out a bit in the UK, but there's still, particularly in the sort of villages and smaller towns, there's still a lot of that idea where you would walk to your local pub. You might be walking there on your own, but you know you're going to see someone there because it's your local community. So it's a kind of a sweet thing, nice community hub.
Yeah, I love it. So you wrote a book. I think it was your first book. Is God anti-gay? Was that your first one, or did you have one before that?
It wasn't my first one, no, but it was. I'd done one or two things before then, but it was the sort of first thing that I think first thing that anyone read.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, it's still selling very well. So that was back in, I want to say 2012, 2013. Is that when it came out?
Came out summer 2013. Yeah.
Okay. And so for those who haven't, if you've engaged a sexuality conversation, you probably have read it. But from my vantage point, if you haven't, if I could summarize it, it is the most, I would say, combining concision. It's a short book, 80, 90 pages or something. I mean, you can read it in, a few hours, but it's also didn't lack in depth and sophistication. It's almost like, I can't believe how thoughtful and in-depth this book was for being such a concise book. So for me, it is the go-to book if you want a short introduction without it losing on the sophistication side, blending good. I mean, obvious to me at least, really sound theology with a really pastoral heart, weaving in your own experience. I mean, such a good book. So you're coming out with a second edition, or is it already out yet, or it's in the works?
It's out, I think, in the next couple of months.
Okay. I'm curious, and this is kind of what we both wanted to talk about, because we both have been in similar spaces for about the same time. What have you seen that has changed in the conversation, specifically, let's just say the broader LGBTQ, SSA, faith conversation in the last 10 years? So maybe taking as two bookends, the first edition of your book and second edition of your book.
Well, that's kind of why I decided to redo the book, is because I thought 10 years is a natural kind of sort of, milestone anyway. But I realized that the world was a totally different place in 2013, and you would have been doing some of your early drafts of People to Be Loved around that time or soon thereafter. It was a different situation. So enough has changed that I thought I needed to redo the book so that it would, I hope, Lord willing, be fit for purpose for the time that we're in now. The culture has changed around us. The questions people ask, I think, have changed in the last 10 years. I think the church has changed in some ways great, in some ways, I think, changed in an unhealthy way. So there's been a lot of things have happened. It's been a busy 10 years just in terms of things moving forwards, the conversation continuing to progress. The most obvious change is that, back in 2013, gay marriage wasn't a legal thing in either the UK or the US. And that now feels like, ancient history. So even that has changed. Not that the book kind of was written with, that particular circumstance in mind, but it's emblematic of how culturally things have moved so much since then. So yeah, lots of things have changed. Language has changed a bit as well around this conversation. Some of the baggage with some of the language has changed. I think there's areas where the church is now much more healthy than it was 10 years ago. And there are pockets of the church, I think, that are less healthy because I think some of those cultural changes have made parts of the church very defensive, very angry, very fearful. And that has certainly affected the conversation around this whole area. But back at you, what have you seen? What are some of the headline differences you've noticed?
I mean, I would agree with all of that. Things do feel even more polarized now in this kind of post-Trump, post-COVID era where everything was just so intensified, and so do
you mean polarized in the church or in culture generally, or both?
Both, because unfortunately I think the church kind of often mirrors and mimics various cultural movements too. So when the culture has become so polarized, many churches have as well. And yeah, I have, so I mean, there's a bit of confirmation bias in how I even analyze how things have progressed, because I'm going off of like my experience in many different churches and denominations over the last 10 years, speaking and working with churches and organizations. And and they've all, for the most part, have been really positive and encouraging experiences, but that's confirmation bias, because those churches invited me to come speak because they saw something in my approach that they valued. So I'm speaking about churches that already there's been some kind of resonance, but I'm from 10 years ago, when it was like, trying to convince churches that, hey, you have LGBTQ, same-sex attracted people in your churches. This isn't an us and them conversation. Your posture can either validate or invalidate your theology, and the importance of tone and posture and listening, not in spite of theology, but as an extension of your theology. I've often said your truth will not be heard until your grace is felt. So if you care about the truth, then all the more need to embody the radical grace of Jesus. And again, that doesn't mean you're being soft on theology or soft on sin or whatever. So all that to say, LGBTQ people, hey, they're people. And, 10 years ago, I was like, oh, yeah, and now it's just kind of like, well, yeah, people are already, I think, churches are not needing to be convinced of having both grace and truth, but are wanting to explore. It's like, okay, we are already there. We want more gay people in our church, not less. How do we navigate holding to our theology and things like policy and leadership and all the nitty gritty on the ground questions of what that looks like? That's where churches are at. So the fact that I don't feel the need in almost every context, even really conservative context. I mean, I remember speaking at a church, and some listeners who are probably part of this church, and they'll laugh, in North Texas, which I'm told is the conservative part of Texas. And most people think Texas is conservative. And they said, no, we're the, I think they even said the county was like 75% voted for Trump on both occasions. And this was a conservative church with a lot of older people in it. So, I mean, all the stereotypes, I'm just like, oh my gosh, what am I getting myself into? And I talked to people that were 70, 80 years old, conservative Baptists that had huge, huge hearts for LGBT people, because they have grandkids that are coming out, and they're like, I love my grandkid. And so I either needed to like just lose relationship or figure out how to be, have a better posture. And so all that to say, like I've been really encouraged by how even very conservative Christians, I think, are really trying to embody the grace, truth, tension of Jesus. Now, I know some people listening are like, oh, that's not my environment or whatever. So again, it's confirmation bias. These are churches that have me come speak. But overall, I would say I'm encouraged by the growing number of churches that I think are approaching this conversation much better than churches have in the past.
Yeah. And I would say I'm far more encouraged than I would be discouraged. There's things that are discouraging to me, but there's far more that's encouraging. And I think that 10 years ago, when I was first being invited to speak on these things, it was often, can you help us understand what the Bible says? Because we're still, does it really say what it, we've taken it to mean about same-sex relationships. So I found a lot of my time then was walking people through the kind of the pertinent biblical passages and saying, yes, it really does mean this. No one's asking that anymore. And I've restructured my book because of that. But it's interesting. Now I think, and I have the same confirmation bias you do, most of the churches that are inviting me to speak, they already know what the Bible says. They just want to make sure that they are embodying the message of the Bible in a way that is, as you say, it's embodying grace and truth. And there's a humaneness to the conversation. And I think part of that is because very few people now don't know someone who identifies as gay or describes himself as same-sex attracted. This issue has come much, much closer to home than it would have been 10 years ago. People are more open, and the number of conversations I have now where it's, hey, my brother is gay, or my son has come out to me, or a really close family friend. And I think for a lot of people, more than 10 years ago, they can put a face on the issue in a way that they couldn't before.
Mm-hmm.
And that always changes your kind of perspective somewhat.
Yeah. I think another key, something we haven't even mentioned yet, but a key change in the last 10 years is the trans conversation has almost,
yeah.
And I would almost trace it back too when there could be an interesting cultural conversation we could have here that I wouldn't be super comfortable being an expert on, but like since 2015, the legalization of same-sex marriage, the older gay people I hear from, like in just broader culture, they're kind of like, we fought for this, like Andrew Sullivan's and Barry Weiss and other kind of public figures. They're kind of like, we fought 20 years for this, or more than 20 years. Society's changed, it's legalized, we're kind of good, we're done. But that has opened up space for, I think, the trans conversation culturally and ecclesiologically to kind of take front and center. And I tell people, we started our organization in 2017, and it was, I would say, most of the emails we're getting from people were questions about sexuality. And I would say a couple of years ago, the percentages almost flipped to where now the majority of emails, questions from parents and pastors and leaders have specifically to do with the trans conversation. And as you know very well, the T is quite different from LGB. And sometimes, I still see people do it, and it's just the way it goes. But people use the acronym LGBT or LGBTQ plus as almost like a synonym for being gay. But it's like, there is a serious overlap, and if you're LGB or T and you've had experience in the church, you're gonna probably have similar experiences most of the time, not every time, but somewhat negative. But beyond that, the theological, philosophical questions that the T raises are quite different, and I think the church is starting to realize that we can't just map our view of marriage onto the trans conversation. You've dealt with this conversation too. I mean, your last book dealt with embodiment, right?
It did not as focused on the trans questions as yours did, but touching on it at least in a very preliminary way. And I agree with you. And in the UK especially, that there's Stonewall split over that issue because the conversation there has been, from what I've picked up, people have formed what is now the LGB Alliance, as distinct from Stonewall, precisely because they want to say that being lesbian, gay, bisexual is a matter of being attracted to a particular sex, not necessarily attracted to a particular gender identity. And so where there seems to be a bit of tension there between, if you are gay, if you're a gay man and you won't date a trans man, you're being transphobic. To which some of the gay people have been replying, well, actually, it's about being attracted to the same sex. So that's been interesting because, again, that embodiedness of biological sex is an issue that for a lot of LGB people is defining of their sexuality. So there's obviously some large overlap as well, but that's been a very interesting conversation just to listen in on going on in that part of the secular world.
I'm curious because you have one foot in both sides of the pond here. From my vantage point, it does seem like just the broader cultural conversation around trans stuff in the UK, it does exactly what you said. It does feel different than the US. So you can confirm that there is more, again, in the broader quote unquote secular world, there's much more public tensions, I would say, between LGBT and T, or even secular feminists and the trans conversation. Whereas in the States, I feel like, and we're 10 years behind the UK culturally, it seems like. So it still seems like people here just naturally lump it all together and still feel like it's the LGBTQ community conversation and at least the tensions within some of the identities aren't as public. Would you confirm that?
I think so. Yeah, there's been a few things in the UK over the years that have sort of really put this issue front and center. There's been a couple of high profile cases where someone has been fired for not sort of being fully on board with trans kind of thinking and ideology. and have, appealed, and it's gone to the courts, and it's been all in the news, and there's been much more of a public conversation about trans rights within a secular community. I mean, J.K. Rowling obviously has been a very prominent voice, sort of saying trans rights need to be, weighed alongside a whole host of other considerations. So I think it's just been a more public, those kind of nuances have become more public, I think, in the UK. And even today, one of the big headlines as we have this conversation is that the Scottish Parliament had passed a new bill saying that you could change your gender identity as young as age 16. And the UK government is, as of today, planning to overturn that. And so that's going to, again, catapult the conversation to the kind of public consciousness. Most people, I think, in the UK, secular people, are not against trans identity and the freedoms associated with that, but are asking questions about, is 16 really a mature enough age to make that kind of decision? Do we need more steps involved? So there's more of those kinds of conversations happening back in the UK than I've heard happening around here.
Well, even, and this isn't my primary area, but I dabble in sort of the medical approaches to teens identifying as trans or non-binary or gender fluid. The U.S. is notoriously very strongly gender affirming, meaning if your gender identity, your internal sense of self is at odds with your biological sex, then there's to question that. Not even question like, are you really, but like even to raise questions like, hey, talk to me about your life. Is there kind of some therapeutic, questions we should at least entertain? Like anything other than affirming one's gender identity for teens is seen as transphobic. And I've talked to medical professionals that say, yeah, it's in some contexts it can be pretty eerie almost. I talked to endocrinologists in particular. I've talked to 3 or 4 different ones, and they said, just from a pretty basic endocrinology perspective, giving somebody who's not fully developed mentally, physically, high doses of a hormone that their body's not naturally producing at that level. I mean, there's kind of just clear, basic kind of endocrinological is that even a word? Risks, you're taking, and we all know, we should know that teenagers are teenagers, and who a teenager identifies as at 15 might not be who I'd be identifying as at 67 or whatever. So should we at least have some caution? But they would, the endocrinologists I've talked to say at the big symposium of endocrinology or whatever, like the stuff that's being told that the practices we must adopt, or it's eerie. They're kind of like there's little to no scientific kind of like discovery that's forcing these changes in practice. We're being told as endocrinologists to do something everybody's looking around knowing like this is not the best science, right? But all that to say, in the UK, when I read stuff and talk to people, there does seem to be a much more maybe I would say healthy kind of conversation around what raising questions. What is the best medical approach to a 16-year-old who, identifies as non-binary, how do we, and has gender dysphoria, maybe depression, maybe has suicide ideation. Like what's the best holistic way to approach this situation? Have you found that? I mean, have you doubt? Oh, you're very aware of some of the debates around that. And
and particularly within the medical community in the UK, and again, public questions being asked about, is this medically good practice to be doing some of these interventions so young? But again, the fact that those questions are being raised in the public square by secular people, I think is a sign that there's a, like you said, a slightly healthier conversation emerging around some of these things. But I don't think these issues were really on my radar 10 years ago. Right. I mean, the T part of LGBT was there in the background, but it was almost as if when the Supreme Court kind of legalized same-sex marriage in the US, it was the starting gun for the trans movement to kind of think, okay, that's done, here's the next one. And it kind of became a very, very prominent thing very quickly after that.
Yeah. How about the church? I mean, have you, when you go and speak at churches now, are you getting asked more questions about the trans conversation than LGB, or is it kind of a mix, or depends on the church probably?
Yeah, it's probably about half and half. I would guesstimate, because the number of particularly young people identifying as non-binary is as you know, so dramatically increasing, that again it's becoming less of an abstract theoretical issue, and this is kids in the church youth group now, kids who've grown up in the church, beginning to identify as non-binary. So it's become more immediate and more urgent for many communities. And the other thing I've noticed is these questions are no respecters of geography.
Right.
So it doesn't actually matter. You could be in Manhattan or you could be in Georgia. Mm-hmm. It's not; these things are not geographically contained, and I think that's been a big shift in the last 10 years. There's a lot of these cultural changes because they're happening through social media, through smartphones, through the way we kind of are shaped these days. It doesn't, if you're a small church in Alabama, you can't afford to say, well, that's just an issue on the East Coast and it's never going to affect us here, because the kids in your own youth group are imbibing the same stuff as kids in the big cities. So yeah. I think that's been a big shift, is the kind of, the social changes and the cultural changes through the Bible Belt are very significant, and helping churches, again, get in on that conversation in as healthy a way as they can.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just came back from a conference that so every year our organization puts on kind of a 2-day conference on sexuality, gender, faith. And we just came back from Pella, Iowa. About an hour east of Des Moines, is population, I want to say 10 or 11,000. I think I got that right. It's a small town. And we've done, this is probably maybe the 25th, 30th conference we've done in the last 5 years. And it was the smallest city we've ever done one at by far. And it was the largest attended conference. We had, I want to say 450 people live. We had another few hundred online from 5 countries to 31 states. I mean, it was, so it just illustrates the point that even in this seemingly small Midwest town, it's like, no, there were people hungering to have this conversation, because again, lots of parents with kids that identify, pastors, leaders, they're working through stuff because people are coming to church, gay and lesbian couples and so on. And they're trying to navigate this conversation. So yeah, I think maybe the percentage might be higher. Like when I go speak in Seattle, it's almost like, youth leaders are asking me, so how do we reach the straight population? Like it's like the sheer number of kids identifying as LGBTQ in their youth groups is, a much higher percentage. And parents, every single parent I met there had I would say on average 2 to 3 LGBT kids. And again, confirmation bias. I'm there to speak on this. They're coming to, but it was still, it's definitely, percentages are much higher, but yeah, no longer is this simply a conversation for churches in more progressive areas,
Yeah.
What's it like in Nashville? Nashville's an interesting place, Bible Belt, but kind of more of a progressive, at least area, at least in some pockets. Or how would you? Yeah,
very much so. The city itself is increasingly secular. I mean, the city's been growing rapidly for the past 10 years, and most of that growth has come from the coasts and from Chicagoland. So the people who are moving in tend to be moving in from more progressive areas. So Nashville itself feels like quite a left-leaning progressive city. You'll see pride flags all over the place. Then when you get out of the city, you're in Tennessee, and you'll see, MAGA hats rather than pride flags. And obviously, so a church in Nashville like mine, you get a bit of both in terms of people from the church. You get both backgrounds represented. So it's a fascinating place. But I think it means that in cities like Nashville, and Nashville won't be unique on this, it's the days where you could just ring the bell at church and people will just turn up. are fading quickly. And so it's very hard to be a pastor now without also being an apologist, because again, these cultural changes are coming to a theatre near you and affecting people in your youth group. I think for many people, there's now the dynamic of trying to reach the younger people, even in our own communities, has become a cross-cultural kind of dynamic now. I think Nashville is a case in point in that. I think the same thing would be being experienced in other cities across the sort of so-called Bible Belt. But it means we have a lot of opportunities. My pastor was sharing with me yesterday, he was chatting to someone recently who, rather than, it's the kind of secular person whose reaction to you being a Christian isn't, well, here's what I disagree with you on. It's, I don't actually know what Christians believe. It's that level of so post-Christian, it's become pre-Christian again in a number of cases.
And again, that's already been there in the UK for a while, right? Would you say?
For 20 years, when I was serving at a church in Oxford and with lots of non-Christians coming through, even then I was already getting people kind of saying, I know this country's been, influenced by Christianity historically, but I don't really know what Christianity says or what people believe. Which in one sense is an easier evangelistic kind of task than someone who has grown up with preconceptions about the Christian faith that aren't true. You have a blank slate, I guess, but is indicative of how ignorant a lot of people are these days of the kind of cultural background, basics you might have picked up about the Christian faith and are just not there as much anymore.
Hey friends, Preston here. As most of you know, I'm an author with David C. Cook Publishing, but I'm also an avid reader. And so I wanted to share with you some of my favorite authors and books. These are authors that have inspired me, challenged me, helped me grow in my faith in new and exciting ways, and I know they'll do the same for you. If you want to find out more, go to davidccook.org/theology in the raw. That's davidccook.org/theology in the raw. I can't wait to hear what you think. Sam, I'm curious. So we talked about kind of your first edition, second edition, the changes in culture. And I'm sure you're going to throw this back on me. Have you changed? Everybody's changed. How have you changed in? I mean, your basic theology hasn't changed, but have you changed anything, whether in your views or posture, emphasis, or who are you now compared to who you were 10 years ago?
Yeah, I hope I'm a wiser person than I was 10 years ago. I find I'm in my 40s. I enjoy each decade way more than the previous one because I'm less dumb. So I'm less dumb than I was in 2013. I think the big thing I would say is my theology hasn't changed in terms of what the Bible says about sexual ethics. I feel as though I have a much more positive message to share with my non-Christian gay friends than I did 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, I was still finessing how to communicate, hey, the Bible says this is not right. I think what I'm trying to sort of say now is, here's how the gospel is good news for you. It's obvious how it's going to be constraining and difficult and so on, but here's how Jesus is good news for us. So I'm hoping I think I added a new section with the new edition, really just to sort of, is Jesus good for us on this issue? Because that to me is the big issue. I feel as though Christ has become more beautiful to me in the past 10 years. And as I have opportunities to speak to secular LGBT groups, I find I'm more convinced now than I was 10 years ago that this is a great context in which to do mission. And therefore, my plea to pastors isn't, please don't think your job is just to hold the line and defend Fortress Church from these kind of cultural forces. Your job is to win people for Christ. And our LGBT friends, many of them are very, very open to spiritual conversations. There's normally a kind of hump to get over where they think you're going to hate them. And so there's defenses up. But I find once people kind of get through the barrier of realizing actually you don't hate them, and you can actually have a safe conversation. I found there's so much fruitful conversations to be had there. So I think I'm more convinced of that than I was 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, I mean, I wrote the book 10 years ago primarily for the church, how to be a bit more biblically clear and compassionate. The new edition, I've actually written for the non-Christian.
Oh, wow. I could see
because
that.
People were giving my old book to non-Christian friends anyway. So I thought, well, if that's how it's being used, let's try and make it a bit more intentionally kind of geared that way and more accessible. So I think I am more compassionate than I was 10 years ago. But I'm more excited about the mission opportunities, more confident that actually I have something good to share with my LGBT friends.
No, that's good.
How about you?
I was going to move on to another question. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely resonate with all of that. Haven't changed theologically. I mean, some people still, I hear stuff, people assuming certain things that I believe. I've had people a friend just told me, he's like, oh yeah, it's pretty widely reported that I am gay and I'm in a mixed orientation marriage. I've been called a gay activist, probably because of my name, I think. That's what somebody told me. With a name like that, you can't be straight. I don't know. People think I'm affirming. People think I'm homophobe. I mean, all across the map, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I would say I am even more convinced, not that I wasn't at all before, but the more I reflect on the theology, more and more convinced that marriage and sex difference as part of what marriage is necessary for the meaning of marriage, for the purpose of marriage. So I don't think God was unclear with this, and I know I think the clarity and convincingness of the theology, and also like exactly what you said, just seeing it is not like, this is kind of a hurdle for people, but this is actually part of God's beautiful revelation of the Creator's design for how humans can best flourish in His creation. Like, it's woven into the creation account. Marriage plays a significant theme, a really complex, beautifully complex role in the biblical storyline. It's not theologically insignificant. And again, none of that was something that I would have disagreed with before, but I think just much, much more clarity in my own mind on that this isn't sexual ethics. It's not some secondary fringe thing. And so and again, people have this kind of zero-sum game in how they treat kind of theology and grace. So people think, oh, so you probably borrowed from your grace tank to strengthen your theology. And I'm like, no, like, because of that beautiful theology, all the more reason to embody this radical kindness of Christ. I'd never have thought, and I'm utterly more convinced that these two are not at odds. And I think probably the number one critique I get that I do believe is a misunderstanding, so maybe it'd be good for me to say it publicly, from people say, yeah, you just kind of like doing the bait and switch, like you dangle this kindness carrot, lure progressive people in, and then they find out you don't affirm same-sex marriage, and it's kind of this bait and switch, and you're just using kindness as kind of like a ploy. And I'm like, I could see where someone would get that. Like, actually, I'm like, I can see where you get that from, because you've been fed a message, I think, that to be kind is to affirm everything.
Yeah.
And I just have never had that presupposition. And I don't try to embody kindness and grace as a way to kind of cover up my theology. It's an expression of my theology. It's an essential part of the posture of Christ. And so for me, it's because I'm so theologically committed that I will all the more say, if we're not embodying the kindness of God as we ought, we're not embodying the truth that we say we uphold, So it's never been an either or. So that's been strengthened. I think, I mean, obviously I've added more knowledge around the trans conversations, since I first started writing on sexuality and recognizing, LGB is quite different from T. Even the whole phrase, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. The phrase LGBTQ affirming or non-affirming, that doesn't, once we get past the B in that acronym, we're dealing with a different set of questions to where, that doesn't, what does that even mean to be LGBTQ affirming? Does that mean you affirm that, 14-year-old teenagers should transition, and to say, I'm not sure they should transition? Is that not affirming? Is that really,
Yeah.
What does it mean to be affirming? Like when it comes to the T, and I think people still aren't sorting some of that out. I don't know why I brought that up. Maybe in my own journey, a deeper understanding of that. There's complexities here that aren't just a one size fits all. There's layers and layers to this conversation. But
I think it's telling that even among my non-Christian friends, just hearing their conversations around these things, even the fact that they will use the phrase LGBTQ, and then they then kind of stumble as to what comes next. And it's as if it's everything after that. They know there's something else that comes after that, but it's a bit kind of vague in their minds, which may be indicative of some of where that conversation is at the moment. People know that there's the gender identity stuff. They know that there are the different forms of sexuality. The category of queer as a sort of more umbrella term is fairly established, but the stuff after that feels less clear to a lot of even my secular friends. Is it I? Is it A? Is it something else? And I think so. People aren't. There's what's the official acronym these days? And it keeps getting adjusted and added to and then tweaked. And even for people who are trying to be good secular people, it can get very confusing.
I do think too that we obviously have way more identity terms today than we did 10 years ago, and I'm not sure. Well, here, I guess let me give two sides of this. I'm not sure that's always helpful. And yet, when you're ministering to people, identity terms can play such a significant role in their journey and their experience. So I've been trying to navigate just that tension of, I just, in some, maybe even many cases, especially with younger people, when they have this angst of finding an identity term that matches exactly their experience. Like I just see that not like adding to their flourishing. Like it seems to create much more angst and, well, I'm not this term anymore. Now I'm this, or now I came out as this identity. And then if they don't have that same experience a year later, there's like social pressure to not change that. I mean, just, it doesn't seem to be, helping in many cases. And yet, if you even question an identity term, there's zero chance at a relationship in most cases, And so I'm just trying to navigate that.
Yeah, I feel as though the identity questions have begun to supersede the actual sexuality and feelings issues. I read an account recently of someone who identifies as lesbian, but recognizes she's not sexually attracted to women, but feels in her identity that she's a lesbian. So that the identity thing there has kind of transcended any kind of particular sexual feelings that you would normally base that identity on. And it feels as though the identity now matters more than the sort of, the things that we would have made defining of that identity.
Yeah. It's like some of the gender categories that are of the non-binary variety. So gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, and there's many others that are not. They're not simply trans man, trans woman. A lot of these identity terms that they feel more ontologically significant than they actually are when I have somebody describe what they mean by the identity. Yeah. I mean, these terms went around 20 years ago, and I'm wondering what the difference, like definitionally or even experientially, what somebody might describe as being a tomboy or something 10, 20 years ago, it's almost word for word the same as like a non-binary experience. But tomboy didn't have the kind of ontological depth that some of these gender identity terms are conveying. And I guess that's where I get nervous, because there could be an internal and external pressure to kind of feel the weight of this identity term when you find one that matches your experience.
Yeah.
When experiences are fluid, and or even, asexual.
That's the thing for me, trying to engage these conversations. That the first thing is, whenever anyone describes themselves as anything like that, my first question is always, I'd love to know what you mean by that, because I don't. Yeah. They could mean any one of, any number of things by that. So it's always helpful when someone says that, even if they said they're gay or they're bi or whatever it might be, gender fluid, say, I'd love to understand what you mean by that, because that will help us engage in the conversation and understand them better. But the other thing I've found is going upstream of that and saying, how do we know who we are? What is that process? And trying to sort of teach into that, and I've been trying to say to people that a sexual identity can't bear the weight of all that you are as a human being made in God's image. There's so much more to you. There's just a heaviness to you, a significance to you. And I love using the woman at the well as a case study for someone who wasn't looking for an identity, but found it as a byproduct of encountering Jesus. And she says, "Come and meet a man who told me everything I ever did. Wow. Could this be the Christ?" He sheds light on her life, what her life had become about. And just trying to liberate people from that sense of, I have to determine and find this identity that will be enough to fit me for the next however many years, and to sort of relieve people of that burden by saying, actually, I'm not saying come back to the old ways of, finding your identity. I'm saying let's come to the person who came up with the idea of you in the first place. Because that is the only way we'll really understand who we are, is when we meet the one who thought us up and created us.
Do you find that message, because I love that, do you find that well received by people, or depends?
I do generally, yes, but particularly because what I'm really trying to do in my own kind of particularly evangelistic method is lean heavily into Genesis 1 as an apologetic, and to, too much evangelism starts in Genesis 3 with, hey, you're a sinner. The Bible doesn't start there. The Bible starts with you are royalty. You were made in the image of God. You have no idea how much you matter. Yeah. And because so much of these discussions have been fraught with self-loathing and all these other kind of mental health issues, I want to start off with that sense of actually, God came up with the idea of you, and Genesis 1 tells me he was having a good day when he did.
Oh, wow. That's good.
And it makes then the presence of sin and the fall all the more poignant and tragic. But I'm trying to show people, Jesus says we're worth more than many sparrows. People don't feel like they are worth much today.
Yeah.
So I'm coming at it from that angle and saying, actually, part of what makes you worth so much is that there's so much more to you than the very things you're tempted to give star billing in your own kind of understanding of who you are. There's something more core, more stable, more just deeper in who you are that gives you value in the eyes of God. So good. And I've seen that help pastorally with people who, I was having a chat with one teenage girl at a church youth group who was very, very, very hostile the whole way through our youth group discussion. But she I could see her wanting to linger at the end. And I thought, I bet she wants to have a conversation with me when no one, that other people can't hear. So whilst people were kind of tidying up in the background, she came up, and the issue for her was self-loathing, desperate self-loathing. And so just trying to open up Genesis 1 to her. And she even said, have you ever felt self-loathing? And if you have, what's helped you? And I said, the gospel helps me with this. Whereas if I pin my sense of worth on my sexuality, I'm putting it on something actually quite fragile and quite unstable. Whereas if it comes from my createdness, from a God who wanted me to exist, then that's a bit more secure.
Wow. So many straight people need the same gospel. Imagine that, Sam.
Oh, exactly.
10 years later, we're like, there's so...
when someone says, can you do a talk on sexuality in the gospel, I'll come along and I'll share a bit of my story. Mm-hmm. But actually, 85% of what I'm sharing is the gospel.
Yeah.
It's just, it's framed in a conversation about sexuality. So it feels as though the whole conversation is about sexuality, but really it's what we're talking about here is the gospel. And that's, I guess, one of my big projects in all that I've done and said in the last 10 years is really just trying to say to the church, we've kind of forgotten how the gospel works here. And we've been confused about issues of sexuality because we've taken those issues out of a gospel framework. Mm-hmm. And all I'm trying to do is put it back in the same gospel framework and say, this is the same gospel for all of us here. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't feel like it because some of us haven't actually thought about the cost of discipleship for ourselves. And so when we're suddenly applying it to our gay friends, it feels a bit unfair. Mm-hmm. Or when we're being far more gracious to ourselves and our own sins than we would be to other people's. So just trying to help the church apply gospel consistency, I think, is one of my great goals in all of this, as I know you do the very same.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. It does feel like we're in a bit of this strange cultural moment post-pandemic. I think the pandemic threw a wrench into even this conversation. We've seen an increase in mental health issues and LGBTQ plus identities. And I don't even know if there's a correlation there. It's just kind of like, maybe because people were kind of, didn't gather for a while and just kind of were away, and we come back, we're like, oh man, it just seems like this conversation is really ramped up. It didn't take a major hiatus. We're also in a confusing political climate, social, cultural climate. Where do you see the church, or maybe not church, let's not start, where do you see this conversation in 2 to 5 years? Do you foresee any changes given kind of different trajectories? Does that make sense? I mean, kind of a broad general question.
Yeah, I've got a few hunches, and I take them with a pinch of salt because most of the things I think, that's definitely going to happen or that will never happen, I'm often wrong. Yeah. So take this with all the caveats that are needed. My suspicion is, I think a few things are going to happen at the same time. I think generally it's going to get harder for us to be theologically orthodox Christians in the Western world. I'm conscious of that. I'm not fearful of that because my understanding of the book of Acts and church history is that it's often at those times the gospel becomes more fruitful. I think it will be a more fruitful time for us. So I'm not worried about that. I think at the same time, my suspicion is we will see a growing and ugly populist backlash against a lot of the trans stuff. Mm-hmm. And to the extent where I think we as the church may need to step in to try to protect some of our trans friends. Yeah. Because when, we don't share all many of the ideological commitments of our trans friends, but we also want them to be treated with dignity and respect. Right. And I'm seeing pockets of, stuff that looks like it's going to be quite an ugly kind of cultural push against some of that stuff. As some of that ideology does the sort of overreach thing, I think there's going to be an ugly backlash to that. Russell Moore once said, if you thought the religious right was bad enough, just wait till you see the irreligious right. And we've begun to see that already. So there are going to be times when the church we will have the honor of getting hit from both sides at once.
That's interesting.
Where we want to protect the dignity of people we profoundly disagree with against those who would demean them and even bully them and target them. but we won't share the ideological assumptions at the same time that a whole other part of culture is insisting we adopt. But I kind of feel like that should be where we excel as the church, because we shouldn't be fitting in anyway. That's
right.
We're strangers and aliens here.
Right.
And this is something that has been very peculiar for me coming into a US context from the UK, is in the UK, as Bible-believing Christians, we never expected to have the top seats at the cultural table. So it's in our DNA to be the kind of, with the minority, we're going to be looked down on. Mm-hmm. That's fine. That's normal for us. Whereas I think for many Christians here, that is a new and deeply unsettling space to have to exist in, which I think is why there's so much rising anger from some parts of the conservative world against just everything.
Yeah.
And even our disposition and posture towards our gay friends by a lot of conservative Christians is seen as capitulation and compromise and cowardice, because they're thinking, hey, we've got to be aggressive and hostile, and I just don't see any biblical warrant for that at all. I think we're not fighting flesh and blood, and our weapons are not fleshly weapons. We fight the spiritual forces with grace and truth and kindness, which is why I just love your ministry, brother.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Yeah, it's high praise. It's funny. It's not funny. It's interesting. Going to your point, it's fascinating to see the secular rhetoric, especially around the trans conversation, to be pretty hostile and aggressive. And it's not just from the religious right. This is something that people aren't in the conversation, they don't realize. When I listen to political commentators, I typically I like the heterodox, kind of left of center, classical liberal thinkers. And actually, it's interesting. Most of the ones I listen to are actually gay, who are left of center. They don't like Republicans at all, but they also are like, they've seen the left get way too far. So they're kind of like speaking out, kind of from, that's their own tribe, but they're speaking out very critically. And they see kind of the trans conversation among, I would say trans activists and kind of that far left kind of ideology. They're very outspoken against that. And I'm listening to their tone. I'm like, wow, like, yeah, you're pretty upset and like saying things that are really aggressive. And I'm like, no longer is it just the religious. I would expect it from the, Tucker Carlson's or whatever. But I'm like, no, I'm listening to people who would hate Tucker Carlson, and it sounds very the same. And to your point, the church has a wide open lane to model and I might even agree with some of the intellectual criticism they have, or things they're saying. I'm like, I'm on board intellectually. You're making good points, but your posture is just so bad. And the church has a wide open door to be critical of ideologies that not only conflict with Scripture, but might be harmful for humanity, and yet model a much, much better posture. And I tell people, for every one activist, let's just say trans activist, there are 99 people who, for whatever reason, are wrestling with their biological sex. Maybe they're confused with different ideologies that they're absorbing. Maybe they're wrestling with mental health issues. Then they're not an act. They might be a victim of some activist ideologies, but they're not an actor. They're just trying to get through the day. They're trying to figure things out. They're 15-year-old teens who are in a really difficult social environment. And goodness, we need to, if all we do is attack activist ideology, we're going to be unintentionally speaking very negatively to people who are in our pews. So we have a wide open door to model a different way. I hope we take that opportunity. I don't always see it, but
I think we have a historic opportunity for the gospel in this particular. I don't want to be a Christian at any other time than right now in the context that we're in. I love that line in Hamilton, look around. We're so lucky to be alive at a time like this. And I feel that way. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think it's going to be, we do have this probably unrepeatable opportunity to model the posture of Christ, the friend of sinners, to our culture, and to show, my personal aim is I want my my gay friends, my trans friends, who know what I think and know how, profoundly I might disagree with them, I nevertheless want to be the kind of person they most feel safe with within that disagreement. Someone they will always feel dignified by, even if I'm not anywhere near, in some cases, the same page as them in terms of beliefs and so on. And I just think that is, in the Lord's hands, that is a powerful thing, because it's God's kindness that leads to repentance. And so if all we're doing is screaming at the internet, I don't think we're going to see people coming to Christ. But if we can show otherworldly kindness to people who know what we think, I think that bears fruit. And we can only do that because we've received that very kindness ourselves. Jesus shouldn't have been kind to me, but he has been kind to me. And that's made me want to express that same heart to other people.
Yeah, so good. Sam, what's on your desk for 2023? What are you doing this year?
Yeah, one of the things is Lord willing, I'm moving to the States full time to be here in Nashville at Emmanuel Nashville Church. I've got a couple of writing projects. I'm writing something at the moment on what it means to be in Christ. So kind of practical exposition of what it means to be united to Jesus. Later in the year, I'm hoping to wade into another kind of cultural issue, which is the environment, and to think through what is a Christian posture towards the physical environment, because it was made for him, by him, through him, and for him. So this physical world belongs to Jesus, and I don't think we can be worshippers of Jesus and be indifferent to what is going on in the physical world around us. And to my secular friends, I want to say, I don't think you will care for the physical world well without knowing the one to whom it belongs. So it'd be fun to wade into that a bit later on as well.
Oh, that's incredible, man. Yeah, I've got several friends who have been in that conversation, and that is another hot button. Unfortunately, it's a hot button issue, creation.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, really love you and your ministry. Thank you for your kind words to me, and I wish we can hang out more. Maybe next time I'm in Nashville. I'm going to be in Chattanooga. Tomorrow. But it's a short trip, and I know that's not right down the street from Nashville. But next time I'm in the neighborhood, I'll definitely look you up, and we'll have to get together.
Please do. I would love that. I would love that so much.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.